"Go back to your garage, Mr. Callahan." Priya Mehta said it without looking up from her phone. Said it the way someone might wave off a mosquito, not with cruelty exactly, just with the casual certainty that certain people did not belong in certain rooms. The garage she was referring to was Callahan Auto Restoration, a 3-bay shop on the edge of Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, where the salt came off the harbor and got into everything. The tools, the coffee, the lungs of anyone who worked there long enough. It wasn't much to look at. Peeling sign out front, a truck on the lift that had been there since Tuesday, a daughter who showed up after school and did her homework at the parts counter because there was nowhere else to go. But Declan Callahan hadn't come to the board meeting of Meridian Harbor Development to talk about his garage. He'd come because Meridian wanted to buy the block his shop sat on, along with 12 other properties, to build what the brochure called a revitalized waterfront mixed-use destination. He'd come because no one from the community had been invited to the consultation, and he'd found that out the same way everyone found things out. From a neighbor who found a letter wedged under their door and called around. He had asked, politely, for 5 minutes to speak on behalf of the business owners on that street. Priya Mehta, director of acquisitions at Meridian, had given him 45 seconds before she said what she said. There were 8 people around the boardroom table. 2 of them looked at their laptops. 1 looked at the ceiling. Nobody said anything. Declan stood up, thanked them for their time, and left. His daughter was waiting in the truck outside. Margot was 11 and had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, a combination that made her simultaneously the easiest and hardest person to raise. She had her seatbelt on and her backpack between her feet, and she was reading something on her tablet, and when he got in she didn't say anything for a moment because she could read his face the way some kids read books, quickly, fluently, without missing anything. "That bad," she said. He started the truck. "What does it mean when your jaw is doing that thing?" "What thing?" "That thing where you look like you're chewing a nail." He pulled out of the parking lot. The harbor was gray today, and the Dartmouth ferry was crossing it. Small and orange in the middle of all that gray. He'd grown up watching that ferry. His father had worked the waterfront. His grandfather had too, after coming over from County Clare with nothing but a trade and a temper, both of which he'd passed along in equal measure. "They don't want to hear from us," he said finally. "They've already decided." Margot thought about that. What happens to the shop? Don't know yet. And what happens to us? He glanced at her. She wasn't panicking. Margot didn't panic. She just gathered information like a small, serious engineer assessing a bridge before crossing it. "We figure it out," he said. "Like always." She nodded and went back to her tablet, and he drove, and the ferry finished its crossing, and the city got smaller in the rear view. Priya Mehta had not grown up with the kind of certainty that Declan Callahan wore like a second skin. She'd grown up in Mississauga in a house where money was careful and quietly anxious, where her parents, who'd immigrated from Bangalore in the 90s, worked hard in ways that were visible and unglamorous, and never discussed at dinner because dinner was for grades and university applications and what Priya's cousins were doing and why Priya wasn't doing it faster. She had learned, very early, that the only way through was to become indispensable. So she had. MBA from Dalhousie, recruited into Meridian at 26, made director at 31. She worked longer than anyone around her, understood the numbers better, and never let them see her doubt herself, because the moment a woman like her showed doubt in a room like that, it became the only thing anyone remembered. She told herself that what she'd said to the man in the lobby was not cruelty. It was efficiency. They had a timeline. The community consultations were legally satisfied. A garage owner from Dartmouth asking to speak was not a stakeholder in the legal sense of the word. She'd been within her rights. She told herself this in the elevator, in the car, and again at her kitchen table at 11 that night, while eating rice and dal out of a container because she had not remembered to eat since noon. She did not think about his face when she'd said it. She did not think about the fact that he hadn't argued back. The properties on Weatherstone Lane had been there since the 50s. The garage was the oldest, originally a Texaco station, that Declan's grandfather had converted when the oil companies pulled out of Atlantic Canada and left a lot of buildings behind. His father had expanded it. Declan had inherited it at 32 when his father's heart had simply decided it was done. He'd been in the Navy then. A lieutenant commander with 14 years in, which is not a thing you walk away from lightly. But Margot's mother had already left by that point, Not dramatically, not with a fight, just a quiet withdrawal over months that ended with a note on the kitchen table and a silence that lasted until she called from Calgary 6 weeks later to say she was sorry, but she wasn't coming back. And Margot had been 4, and Declan had looked at his daughter and then at his transfer orders and made the choice that felt like the only choice there was. He didn't talk about it. What was there to say? He'd served 12 years before his father, 4 after, 16 total. He'd been in the Gulf, in the Pacific, in the North Atlantic on exercises so classified he still couldn't mention them by name. He'd been good at it, more than good. But the Navy had been one life, and Margot was another, and you can only live one life at a time. So he came home, learned the restoration work properly, the way his father had tried to teach him, and he'd been too young to absorb. Hired 2 good mechanics, got a reputation for being the only shop in the Halifax regional municipality that could make a 1967 Chevelle look like it had never left the showroom, didn't advertise much, didn't need to, and now Meridian Harbor Development wanted to turn it into a lobby. He told his mechanics, Bertie, who was 63 and had worked for his father, and a young guy named Quincy who was 25 and had more natural talent than anyone Declan had ever seen. He told them on a Thursday morning, straight out, because that was the only way he knew how to do things. Meridian's moving on the block, he said. We've got maybe 4 months before they start pushing paperwork. Bertie put down his coffee. Quincy looked at the floor. What do we do? Quincy asked. We keep working, Declan said, and I find us a way out of this. He didn't know yet what that way was, but he'd figured out harder things in worse conditions, and he'd learned a long time ago that you didn't solve a problem by staring at the size of it. The way he found it started, oddly enough, with a broken differential. A black Escalade had limped off the bridge and into his lot on a Tuesday afternoon, leaking fluid and making a sound like a bag of rocks in a dryer. The driver, a man about Declan's age in a suit that cost more than Quincy's monthly rent, had stood in the lot looking helpless while Declan looked under the vehicle. How long? The man asked. Day and a half. I need it today. You need a time machine, Declan said. I've got a differential rebuild and 3 jobs ahead of you. If you need it today, try Burnside. The man looked at him for a moment, then made a call and came back calmer. 2 days is fine. The Admiral's going to kill me either way. Declan had glanced up then. Which Admiral? The man looked surprised. Forsyth. James Forsyth, you know him? Declan set down his rag. Vice Admiral James Forsyth. He hadn't heard that name in 7 years. He'd last seen Forsyth on the deck of HMCS Ville de Quebec, somewhere in the North Atlantic, when Forsyth had been a Commodore and Declan had been running the most complicated night rescue operation of his career in 40-knot winds and 0 visibility, and Forsyth had stood back and let him do it because he'd trusted his lieutenant commander completely. Yeah, Declan said. I know him. Priya Mehta's second mistake, the first had been Tuesday in the boardroom, was sending a junior associate named Todd to do the formal property notification for Weatherstone Lane. Todd was 24 and eager and wore the wrong shoes for Dartmouth, and he stood in the garage bay with his clipboard while Declan wiped down a quarter panel and listened to him explain the compensation structure that Meridian was offering. It was, objectively, below market, not insultingly so, but enough. Miss Mehta is available for a call this week if you'd like to discuss. Tell Ms. Mehta, Declan said, not unkindly, that I'm not interested in a call. I'm interested in a meeting. With the board, not just acquisitions. Todd wrote something down. She'll likely want to know on what grounds. Heritage property application, Declan said. My grandfather built this. It predates the zoning changes. There's a case to be made. This was not a bluff. He'd spent 3 evenings with a heritage consultant his neighbor had recommended, going through the documentation. The original station had been built in 1951. There were photographs, municipal records, 2 letters from the city's historical society. It wasn't a certainty, but it was enough to slow things down. Todd left with his clipboard and his wrong shoes, and Bertie came out from under the truck he'd been working on and said, You actually going to fight this thing? I'm going to make it expensive for them to push us out, Declan said. Different thing. Priya found out about the heritage application on a Friday afternoon, 15 minutes before she was supposed to leave for a flight to Toronto. She sat down and read the preliminary filing and felt something shift in her chest. Not quite panic, but adjacent to it. A heritage designation, even a failed one, could delay the timeline by 8 to 14 months. The investors had a window. If they missed it, the financing structure unraveled. She canceled her flight. She pulled up everything Meridian had on Callahan Auto Restoration, the ownership history, the tax records, the correspondence log from the community notification. She read the account of Tuesday's meeting. She read what Todd had filed about his site visit. Then she looked up Declan Callahan. It took her about 6 minutes to find what she found. She had a research background and knew how to use it, and what she found made her sit very still for a moment. Lieutenant Commander Declan Callahan, Royal Canadian Navy, retired, 16 years. Decorated twice, once for a Marine rescue in the Beaufort Sea, once for an operation she couldn't find details on because the details were not publicly available. Cited by name in a maritime review for saving the lives of 11 personnel in conditions described as extreme. Currently residing in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. Currently owner and operator of Callahan Auto Restoration. She read it twice. Then she thought about what she'd said in the boardroom. Go back to your garage, Mr. Callahan. She picked up her phone and put it down again. Margot had found the article about the heritage application before Declan had told her about it. She found most things before he told her because she had set up a Google alert on the garage's address after the first Meridian letter had arrived. A piece of initiative he found impressive and slightly exhausting. Heritage property, she said at dinner. Her fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Like a museum, like a building with history that they can't just knock down because they feel like it. Could we put up a display? She said. About great-granddad. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'm serious. There are photos of him at the original station. Gran has them. We could frame them. The Historical Society would love it. He looked at her. She was, as usual, 3 steps ahead of him and entirely serious. Maybe, he said. She ate her dinner with the air of someone who had already decided maybe meant yes. The meeting that changed everything was not the one Declan had asked for. It was a Thursday morning, ordinary in every way. Bertie was in early, Quincy was 20 minutes late as usual, and Declan was on the phone with a parts supplier about a back-ordered intake manifold when the black Escalade, repaired now, running smoothly, pulled into the lot. The driver got out. And then the back door opened and Vice Admiral James Forsyth got out, in civilian clothes, but somehow managing to look like he was in uniform anyway. That was the thing about certain men. Rank had a way of staying in the posture even when the uniform came off. Declan ended his call. Forsyth looked around the lot for a moment, then at the shop, then at the sign. Then he looked at Declan and walked over and extended his hand. Should have found you sooner, Forsyth said. Sir, retired Callahan. It's James. They shook hands. The Escalade's driver, the suit from before, whose name turned out to be Patrick, leaned against the car and scrolled his phone with the tact of someone who understood when they were not needed. Patrick tells me you're having trouble with a development company, Forsyth said. Nothing I can't handle. No, I imagine not. Forsyth looked at the garage again. Your father's place? Grandfather's originally. Forsyth nodded slowly. You know I've been on the Harbor Commission for 3 years. Declan had not known that. I don't generally use the position for personal favors, Forsyth continued, but I do believe in due process. And what you've described to Patrick, a community consultation that was notification only, no genuine engagement, properties with potential heritage significance, that's not due process. That's box ticking. I'm not looking for special treatment, Declan said. I know you're not. That's why I'm here. Forsyth put his hands in his pockets. The commission has a public interest review mechanism. I'm suggesting you file for one, formally with documentation. He glanced at Declan. I may also have mentioned to a few people on the board of Meridian's investment group that there was a veteran community presence on Weatherstone Lane that hadn't been adequately addressed. Declan was quiet for a moment. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know. How's your daughter? Priya had requested the meeting herself. She was aware by that point of the Harbor Commission inquiry. She was aware that it had generated 3 news items in local outlets and 1 piece in the Chronicle Herald that had been shared 400 times. She was aware that her director of communications had used the phrase optics problem twice in 1 sentence. She drove to Dartmouth herself, parked in the lot, walked into the garage bay where Declan was working on a car she didn't recognize, old red, some kind of muscle car, and she stood there in her coat until he looked up. Ms. Mehta, he said, not surprised, not quite. Mr. Callahan. She looked around the shop, tools hanging in order on pegboards, a shelf of parts manuals, a child's drawing taped to the wall beside the cash register, a house, a car, a stick figure with curly hair labeled Daddy in purple crayon, She looked at that drawing longer than she meant to. I came to say she started and then stopped because she had rehearsed this on the drive over and all of it suddenly felt inadequate. I came to say that what I said in the boardroom was dismissive, and I'm sorry for it. Declan set down his wrench. He didn't say anything. I'm also here because the commission inquiry has opened a formal review, which means the timeline is affected regardless of what I say or don't say. I want you to know that I'm not here because of the review. She paused. I'm here because I was wrong, and I'd like to do this differently. He studied her for a long moment. She had the feeling he was very good at reading people, the kind of good that came from having needed to, in conditions that were not comfortable. What does doing it differently look like? He said. It means we sit down with the other business owners, genuinely. Not with a prepared package and a timeline, but with an actual conversation about what this block means, what a development would need to preserve, and whether there's a model that doesn't require us to push you out. She took a breath. It's slower. It may not work, but it's real. He was quiet for a moment. The woman next door has been on this street for 31 years, he said. She runs an alterations shop. She's never been late on her lease. Meridian sent her notification in English only, and her first language is Cantonese. Priya closed her eyes for just a second. That shouldn't have happened. No, he said. It shouldn't. He picked up a rag and wiped his hands slowly. Thursday, he said. I'll get the business owners together. Bring a translator. Bring someone who can actually make decisions, not just take notes. She nodded. I'll be there myself. She turned to go, and then she heard him say, Mrs. Mehta. She turned back. He wasn't smiling exactly, but something in his face had shifted, not warm yet but no longer closed. You want coffee? It's not good coffee, but it's hot. She had 3 calls waiting and a report due before 5. Yeah, she said. Okay. She came back Thursday with a translator and the head of Meridian's development design team, a man named Albrecht who wore round glasses and talked about buildings with the enthusiasm of someone who actually loved them, which turned out to be useful. She also came back Monday because she had a follow-up question for Declan about the 1951 property records, and the following Friday, which she would later have difficulty fully explaining because the question she'd needed to ask had been answered by email that morning, and she drove to Dartmouth anyway. She stood in the parking lot for a minute before going in. Then she went in. Margot met her on the 3rd visit. She came in from school with her backpack on and her ponytail slightly crooked, took a juice box from the mini fridge behind the counter and climbed onto the stool she apparently used as a homework chair, and regarded Priya with the comprehensive assessment of an 11-year-old who had learned to read adults very quickly. You're the one from the company, Margot said. I am. You said go back to your garage. I did. Priya didn't look away. I was wrong to say it. Margot considered this. She opened her juice box. Dad doesn't talk about it, but Bertie told me. Bertie talks a lot. Bertie's great. She drank her juice. Are you going to take the shop? We're trying to find a way that doesn't require that, Priya said. What if you can't? Then we haven't found it yet. Margot looked at her for another moment, then apparently decided this was sufficient and opened her math textbook. There's coffee if you want, she said without looking up. It's not good. So, I've heard. The public interest review took 4 months. In that time, Meridian's design team produced 3 revised development proposals, each one incorporating more of what the Weatherstone Lane business owners had said they needed. Shared loading, maintained frontage, a phased approach that would allow temporary relocation during construction rather than permanent displacement. The heritage application for the original station building was ultimately approved in part. The facade and the structural frame would be preserved and incorporated into whatever was built. Bertie thought this was ridiculous. Half a building, he said. What's the point of half a building? The point, Declan said, is that it's still standing. The Harbor Commission held a public presentation of the revised plan on a Tuesday evening in February in a community hall in Dartmouth that smelled like old carpet and good intentions. Vice Admiral Forsyth was there in the back row, in civilian clothes, looking like he was in uniform. Declan's neighbor from the alterations shop was there, and she had brought her granddaughter to translate. Todd from Meridian was there, in better shoes this time. Quincy came and sat in the back and looked at his phone for most of it, but he was there. Priya presented the revised plan herself. She had spent 3 weeks on the presentation and it showed, not in the polish of it, which was considerable, but in the specifics. She knew the names of every business owner on the block. She knew what each one had said they needed. When she said that the plan aimed to preserve the character of a street that had been serving the Dartmouth community for over 70 years, she was not reading from a slide. Afterward, standing in the parking lot while people filtered out into the February cold, Declan came to stand beside her. "You did well in there," he said. "We'll see. They have 30 days to submit objections. They'll have some, they always do." She pulled her coat tighter. The harbor was visible at the end of the street, dark and very still, the lights of Halifax reflecting in it. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure. When you were in the Navy, did you ever—" She paused, finding the right words. "Did you ever have to fight for something you weren't sure you could win?" He thought about that for a moment. "Almost every time," he said. "What did you do?" "Same thing you did tonight." He looked at her, showed up and told the truth and let people decide. She was quiet for a moment. "I looked you up," she said, "after the boardroom. I found your service record, what was public, anyway." He didn't say anything. "I didn't know," she said. "Not that it should have mattered. You shouldn't have to have been a lieutenant commander for me to." She stopped herself. "I'm sorry, for the boardroom. I said it before, but I want to say it properly." "You did say it properly," he said. "In the garage, the first time." She looked at him. "I heard it," he said. "It counted." Margot found out about the presentation from Bertie, who attended and then provided a detailed and only partially accurate debrief the next morning. She was pleased about the facade preservation in a way that suggested she had already been planning the display about her great-grandfather and was glad to have something to attach it to. She assembled the photographs herself. Gran sent the ones she had. The original station in 1952, her grandfather in his coveralls, the hand-painted sign. Margot found 2 more at the archives, with the help of a librarian she'd emailed with a formality of address that had slightly alarmed the librarian and then charmed her completely. She framed them and put them on the wall beside the cash register, next to the purple crayon drawing. Declan stood in front of them for a long time the morning she put them up. "These are good," he said. "I know," Margot said. The development proceeded, amended and slower than Meridian had planned, which turned out to be fine. Albrecht found that the constraints imposed by the preserved facade made the building more interesting, not less, and he said so loudly and repeatedly until people believed him. The alterations shop relocated to a temporary space 2 blocks over and came back when the construction was done, to a unit that had a proper back entrance and better light. Quincy, who had been anxious about the whole thing from the beginning, ultimately moved the auto restoration operation to a larger space in the north end, and called it Callahan North, which Declan thought was slightly grandiose and Margot thought was perfect. Priya Mehta stayed in Halifax. This had not been the plan. She had a promotion offer in Toronto and had been intending to take it. She deferred it twice and then declined it, which generated a conference call with her director that she handled with a directness that left very little room for follow-up questions. There were professional reasons for staying. The Weatherstone Lane project had produced a community development model that Meridian was applying elsewhere. She was leading it. There were also other reasons, which she did not explain in the conference call. The first time Declan asked her to dinner, they were standing in the garage after everyone else had gone, and she had come by, ostensibly, to drop off a document he'd been waiting on. He could have told her the document could have been emailed. He didn't. "There's a place on the waterfront," he said. "Open late. Decent seafood." She looked at him. He was still in his work clothes, had a smear of grease on his forearm he hadn't noticed, and was looking at her with the careful directness that she had come to understand was not coldness but precision. He said what he meant, and waited to see what you'd do with it. "I have early calls tomorrow," she said. "It's Thursday, that's true, and the document could have been emailed." She looked at the document in her hand, then she put it on the counter. "Decent seafood," she said. "How decent?" "Good enough," he said. "Not the best, but worth it." Vice Admiral Forsyth sent a note to Declan when he heard, through Patrick, through the particular efficiency of men who have served together and know how to get information without asking directly. The note said, "Good. Long overdue. Give my best to Margot." Then, below that, in handwriting Declan recognized, "The shop looks well. Your father would have been glad." Declan read it twice and put it in the drawer where he kept things that mattered. On a Sunday in late April, the harbor was the color that it gets when winter finally lets go. Not quite blue, not quite silver, something in between that only exists for a few weeks a year in Nova Scotia, and that people who've lived there their whole lives cannot entirely describe to people who haven't. Margot was at the restored building with her photographs, overseeing their installation, with a precision that had made the contractor briefly uncertain who was in charge. Declan stood outside with his coffee and watched the harbor do what it did, and thought about his grandfather crossing the Atlantic with nothing but a trade and a temper, and about his father who had expanded the shop and then left it the same way. You leave anything you've built, imperfectly, with things unsaid, hoping you'd done enough. He thought about Margot's purple crayon drawing on the wall, which had survived the renovation because he had taken it down himself before the work began and kept it in his truck until the new walls were up. Priya came and stood beside him. She had paint on her jacket from helping with the installation, which she would later point out was not in her job description and which Margot had specifically asked for. "She's going to be a project manager," Priya said. "At minimum," he said. They stood there for a while. The ferry crossed the harbor, small and orange against the silver blue. "It's good," she said, meaning more than one thing. "Yeah," he said, meaning the same. The ferry finished its crossing. The harbor went on being the color it was, and somewhere behind them, Margot directed someone to move a photograph 3 centimeters to the left, and the sound of it, her voice, clear and certain, not doubting herself for a moment, carried all the way to where they stood.